You see this term everywhere, right? On the news, in articles, GDP, gross domestic product. It's thrown around like it's the ultimate scorecard for how a country is doing. But what is really hiding behind that number? All right, let's get right into it.
Yeah, you've seen a headline like this a million times. It sounds fantastic, doesn't it? The economy's soaring, GDP's up. It feels like a clear sign that everything's getting better, that we're on the right path. It's just so simple.
But what are we actually celebrating? Does a 3% jump in GDP mean your life is 3% better? Is it the whole story? Well, spoiler alert, it's not. And that's exactly what we're going to unpack in this explainer. We're going to look way beyond the headlines.
So, here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with what GDP is actually trying to count. Then we'll look at the difference between what happens inside a country versus what its citizens do. After that, we'll tackle the big one, telling the difference between real growth and just rising prices. And finally, we'll cover a couple of clever tricks economists use to keep the numbers honest.
Okay, let's start with the absolute basics. The simplest way to think about GDP is like a country's total score for its economic performance in a given year. So, at its core, GDP adds up the value of every single thing made and every service provided within the boundary of a country for 1 year. Now, that phrase, within the boundary, is absolutely crucial. It doesn't matter who owns the factory. If it's physically built or done in that country, it counts. It's all about geography.
And just for a little background, this whole idea was cooked up by an economist named Simon Kuznets. Here in India, the huge job of actually calculating this number belongs to the National Statistics Office, or NSO, which is part of the Ministry of Statistics.
Okay, so it's all about what's made inside a country. Simple enough, right? Well, not so fast. What about a country's citizens who are earning money somewhere else in the world? This is where we need to introduce a slightly different concept. This is the exact question GDP can't answer by itself. For instance, think about an Indian engineer working in Silicon Valley. Her salary and the value she creates contribute to the GDP of the United States, not India. So how do we measure the total economic power of a country's people, no matter where they live?
For that, we turn to gross national product, or GNP. And notice the big change in wording here. GNP doesn't care about borders, it cares about citizenship. It's the total value produced by a country's nationals, whether they're at home or halfway across the world.
So here it is, the simplest way to keep them straight. GDP is about geography, what happens inside the lines on a map. GNP is about citizenship, what a country's people produce, period. Geography versus citizenship, that's the key difference.
And what's cool is they're linked by a pretty simple formula. You just start with the country's GDP, and then you add something called net factor income from abroad. It sounds complicated, but it's not. It's just the money your citizens earn overseas minus the money foreigners earn inside your country.
All right, we've got a handle on GDP versus GNP, but there's another huge wrinkle we need to iron out. When you see that headline, GDP up 3%, you have to ask a really important question. Are we actually making more stuff, or are things just getting more expensive? Imagine this. 1 year, a country makes 10 cars, and each one costs $10,000. The GDP from cars is $100,000. Simple. The next year, they still make exactly 10 cars. But because of inflation, each car now costs $11,000. The GDP is now $110,000. On paper, that looks like 10% growth. But did we actually produce anything more? Nope. That's the inflation trap. So to get around this, economists use two different versions of GDP. There's nominal GDP, which uses today's prices. It's great for just seeing the raw size of an economy. But then there's real GDP. This is the one that tells the true story of growth. It strips away inflation by using prices from a fixed year in the past. It tells us if the actual quantity of goods and services went up. In other words, real GDP shows how well a country is really doing.
Now, this doesn't mean nominal GDP is useless. Not at all. It gives you a fantastic snapshot for comparing the sizes of different economies right now. For instance, using that nominal GDP measure, India is currently the world's 5th largest economy.
Okay, next up is a really clever puzzle that economists had to solve. It's a potential trap known as the double counting problem. How do you add everything up without accidentally counting the same value more than once?
And the solution is actually pretty elegant. You just decide to count the value of final goods only. A final good is the finished product that's sold to the end user. You ignore all the ingredients and parts that went into it. Those are called intermediate goods, because their value is already included in the final price.
The car and tire example makes this super clear. A factory makes tires. Those are an intermediate good. A car company buys them to build a car. The finished car is the final good. Now, if you counted the value of the tires when they were sold, and then counted the full value of the car, you'd be counting the tires twice. So, economists only count the final price tag of the car, which already has the cost of the tires baked into it. Simple.
Remember how we mentioned that real GDP uses prices from a base year to get rid of inflation? Well, let's zoom in on that for a second, because choosing the right base year is absolutely essential.
Think of the base year as your anchor in time. It provides a stable set of prices that we can use to compare production levels across different years. It's the only way to get a true apples-to-apples comparison. The key is you have to pick a pretty normal and recent year, one without a huge economic crisis or a war that sent prices haywire.
And of course, you can't just pick one base year and stick with it forever. You have to update it. In India, the policy for this has changed over the decades. What's really interesting is that they skipped the 2009-10 revision. Why? Because the whole world was still reeling from the 2008 financial crisis, which made it a terrible year to use as a stable baseline. Right now, India is still using 2011-12 as its official base year. So let's bring it all home. The next time you see that big GDP number in a headline, you'll know there's a lot more going on. You'll know to ask, are we talking about what's made in the country or by its citizens? Is this number showing real growth or is it just inflation? Are we sure we're not double counting? It's these details that tell the real story.
And all of this brings us to a much, much bigger question. We've just spent all this time figuring out what GDP is, but is it the best way to measure a country's success? I mean, it doesn't say anything about happiness or the environment or inequality. So while it's a really powerful economic tool, is it the final word on a nation's well-being? That's something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.